It was a gray November afternoon in Fairhollow, a quiet town nestled deep in the Virginia hills, where time moved a little slower and secrets lingered like fog over the old rooftops. The air was sharp with the chill of the coming winter, and the rusted gate of the county animal shelter let out a groan as it swung open. Tavian Crosswell, 57, walked down the narrow concrete corridor between rows of kennels, his hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, his gaze distant, heavy with the weight of memories he no longer spoke about. He had been alone for 3 years now. The silence of his house echoed louder with every passing month. Since the day he buried his wife, not a single soul had crossed the threshold of his front door for more than a few minutes. No kids, no grandkids, just the creak of old wood floors and the humming of a broken radiator. A dog, he thought, might not fix the loneliness, but it could keep the quiet from swallowing him whole. Dogs barked and howled as he walked by, some pacing anxiously, others throwing themselves against their cage doors, begging for attention. Tavian didn't stop until he reached the far end of the shelter, where the lights flickered and the air felt colder somehow. That's where he saw him. A tiny German shepherd pup, curled in a corner, so still it almost looked like a stuffed toy. The pup didn't bark. He didn't move. His eyes were locked on Tavian's with a depth that made him stop in his tracks. Wet, glassy eyes so dark they looked almost human. It wasn't just the sadness in them. It was something else. Something that felt ancient. Tavian crouched slowly and extended a hand through the bars. The dog didn't flinch. Instead, after a pause, he stood and gently placed one trembling paw in Tavian's palm. It was like a handshake, like trust being offered by something that had every reason not to trust anyone. "You're not like the others, are you?" Tavian whispered. Behind him, footsteps approached. Merrick Haldridge, one of the shelter volunteers, stopped beside him and looked into the cage. "That one?" he asked. "Nobody's come close to him. He just sits there, barely eats, doesn't bark, doesn't play. We don't even know his name." Tavian didn't take his eyes off the dog. "Where'd he come from?" "Someone tied him to the gate 2 weeks ago. No note, no microchip, collar so old we almost missed it. But no ID tag. No one ever came looking." "I'll take him." Merrick raised a brow. "You sure? He gives most folks the creeps. Some of the staff won't even clean his cage unless they have to." Tavian finally looked away from the dog. "He chose me. That's enough." 15 minutes later, Tavian was back in his pickup truck with the puppy swaddled in an old wool blanket on the passenger seat. The dog was silent, his head resting on the seat, eyes watching the road ahead as if he knew where they were going. Tavian drove without music, occasionally glancing over. "You've been through some stuff, huh?" he murmured. "Same as me." As he pulled into the long dirt driveway that led to his home, the sun was already beginning to fall behind the treetops. The house stood alone on the edge of the forest, tall and weathered, its porch light flickering dimly against the growing shadows. Tavian lifted the dog from the seat and carried him up the steps. It was only when he reached the front door that he noticed something odd. The old leather collar around the pup's neck had a bulge stitched into the inside. Curious, he unclipped it carefully and turned it over in his hands. The leather was cracked and stiff, but something small was tucked inside the seam. A rusted key. And beneath it, a scrap of folded, yellowed paper. Tavian held his breath as he opened it. The handwriting was faded but legible. Lyndon Greythorne, 141 Wren Hollow Lane. And below it, in a shakier hand, "If you're reading this, it means he chose you." Tavian froze. He looked down at the puppy, who sat quietly at his feet, looking up at him with those impossibly deep eyes. And in that moment, the silence of his home didn't feel so empty. Felt like a doorway. And Tavian Crosswell, without knowing how or why, had just stepped through it. Tavian sat at the kitchen table long after the sky had gone black, the crumpled note and the rusted key lying in front of him like relics from a life that didn't belong to him. The dog, still unnamed, lay curled at his feet, breathing slow and steady. Every so often, Tavian would glance down, half expecting the pup to vanish like a dream. But he was there, solid, quiet, watching even in sleep. Tavian couldn't stop thinking about the words on the paper. If you're reading this, it means he chose you. What did that mean? Chose him for what? After pouring himself a cup of coffee he didn't really want, Tavian pulled out his old laptop. The internet at the house was patchy, but enough to run a search. He typed in the name from the note, Lyndon Greythorne. Dozens of results popped up, mostly outdated obituaries and property records from nearby towns. Then one entry caught his eye. A news article from 20 years ago titled, Retired Cryptographer Disappears Without a Trace. Tavian's heart skipped. The photo showed a man in his 60s, white hair, glasses, and a worn leather coat. But what drew his attention most was the dog sitting at the man's side. A German shepherd, younger, but with the same markings, the same eyes. Tavian leaned back in his chair, a shiver running through him. Was it the same dog? That would be impossible. But the resemblance was undeniable. The article claimed that Lyndon Greythorne had worked for a federal agency during the Cold War, then retired quietly to a secluded property just a few towns over, 141 Wren Hollow Lane. The same address on the note. According to the article, Greythorne vanished without warning, leaving his house locked and his accounts untouched. No body, no explanation, just gone. The key sat on the table like it had been waiting for years to be held again. Tavian picked it up, turning it over in his palm. It was heavier than it looked, with a strange symbol etched into one side, a faint carving of a raven in flight. The edges were worn smooth by time. The weight of it felt personal, like something meant to be passed from one hand to another, from one life to the next. Down by his feet, the puppy stirred and stood. He stretched, then looked up at Tavian with a quiet intensity. Not fear, not confusion. It was as if he knew Tavian had found the key, as if he'd been waiting for this moment all along. Tavian didn't speak. He just nodded slowly. The next morning brought a thick layer of frost on the windows and a silence in the air that felt heavier than usual. Tavian stood at the edge of his driveway, staring out at the forest that wrapped around his property like a secret. The puppy sat beside him, tail still, eyes fixed forward. He hadn't barked once, not since Tavian brought him home. And yet, there was no mistaking it. The dog was alert, waiting for something. Tavian didn't know why, but he couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at his chest, that the key in his pocket had unlocked something far more than an abandoned house. He packed a small bag with a flashlight, a thermos of coffee, and the old revolver he hadn't touched in years. It wasn't fear, not exactly. It was instinct, as if his bones remembered something his mind didn't. The pup followed him without hesitation, hopping into the passenger seat like he'd done it 100 times before. Tavian glanced at him. I guess we're doing this, huh? The dog didn't move, didn't blink, just stared straight ahead. It took 40 minutes to reach Wren Hollow Lane, a narrow, winding road that disappeared into a dense patch of woods. The GPS stopped working halfway through. Tavian relied on the handwritten directions he'd scribbled down from the article. When he finally reached the gate, he had to stop the truck and get out to push it open. It was rusted and tangled in ivy, like no one had touched it in decades. The house beyond was barely visible through the trees. A two-story farmhouse, pale gray with time, the windows shuttered, the porch sagging under years of weight. Tavian approached the front door, heart pounding in his ears. He pulled the key from his pocket. It slid into the lock like it had never left. One soft click, and the door creaked open. The air inside was cold and dry, heavy with dust and something else. A faint smell of old paper and cedar. The dog stepped in before Tavian did, as if leading the way. Inside, the house was intact but frozen in time. Stacks of newspapers from the late 90s were piled near the entryway. A coat still hung by the door. Books lined every wall, and on the far side of the room, a desk stood covered in notebooks, maps, and loose pages. Tavian stepped closer, running his fingers across the desk surface, brushing away a thin layer of dust, until he saw it, a photograph. It was a picture of Lyndon Greythorne, and the same German shepherd, standing in the very room where Tavian now stood. Tavian stared at the photograph, barely breathing. It was worn and faded, but the image was clear. Lyndon Greythorne standing in front of the very desk where Tavian now stood. His hand rested proudly on the back of the same German shepherd that now paced quietly behind Tavian. Same markings, same eyes, same strange stillness. The picture was dated in the corner, 1999. That couldn't be right. The math didn't add up. That would make the dog over 25 years old. No dog lived that long. And yet, here he was. He reached down and gently placed the photo in his jacket pocket, his hands trembling slightly. Around the room, the dust-covered notebooks and yellowed papers whispered the weight of secrets left behind. Tavian flipped open one of the journals. Inside were rows of symbols, strange coordinates, and scribbled equations. But among the technical jargon, a name kept appearing, Emmerich Veilhart. Underneath it, several times, in all caps, the same phrase, "Do not contact." As Tavian flipped further, he found a letter tucked between the pages. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a paragraph, written in the same shaky handwriting as the note hidden in the dog's collar. "If he finds you, do not run. Do not try to return him. He carries what I couldn't. If you are reading this, it means I failed. But maybe you won't." Tavian stepped back from the desk, his breath unsteady. Whatever Lyndon Greythorne had been involved in, it wasn't just science or secrets. It was something personal, something unfinished. The house creaked above him. Tavian looked up instinctively. The dog had gone stiff, ears perked, eyes fixed on the staircase that led to the second floor. A low rumble vibrated in his chest. Still no barking, just a deep, resonant growl that made Tavian's blood run cold. Slowly, he moved toward the base of the stairs. Each step groaned under his weight, and the air grew colder the higher he climbed. At the end of the hall was a closed door with scratch marks along the bottom, as if something or someone had once tried desperately to claw their way in. Tavian hesitated. Then, with a deep breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. Inside was a room that looked untouched. A bed neatly made, curtains drawn shut, and against the far wall a large metal safe, half concealed behind a faded curtain. The dog sat in the doorway, unmoving, watching, waiting. Tavian stepped toward the safe and froze. Etched into the metal in deep, deliberate strokes was a single word, Ashmere. Tavian traced the word with his fingers, the cold metal biting at his skin. Ashmere. He didn't recognize it as a place or a person, yet it rang in his mind like something buried deep in memory. The letters were scratched into the surface with force, not engraved carefully like a nameplate. This was done in urgency, maybe even desperation. Behind him, the German shepherd remained in the doorway, eyes fixed on the safe, tail still. Tavian swallowed. There was no combination dial, no keyhole, just the word. And just as he began to wonder how it opened, a sharp click echoed from within. The metal door creaked ajar, as if responding to his presence alone. Tavian hesitated, then pulled it open. Inside was a stack of sealed envelopes, a faded leather-bound journal, and a small black device no bigger than a deck of cards. The journal looked older than everything else. Edges worn, leather cracked, but the initials on the front were clear. Tavian sat down on the bed, heart racing. Corbin Ashmere. That had to be it. Another name, another thread in this tangled story. He opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was neater, more structured than Greythorne's. The first line stopped him cold. They were never supposed to survive this long. The entries that followed detailed a project, codenamed Emberfield. Names, locations, behavioral notes. It read more like a classified field log than a diary. One line near the middle made Tavian grip the pages tighter. Subject 9 exhibits awareness beyond conditioning. His attachment is voluntary. He remembers. Tavian's eyes flicked to the dog, who now stood quietly at his side, ears low, watching him with the weight of something old, something knowing. Could this dog be Subject 9? Flipping further, Tavian found mention of a man named Wren Hollow Lane, identified as a risk to the program, and marked as terminated, unconfirmed. The last entry, dated 3 days before the article claimed Lyndon Greythorne vanished, read simply, "If you're reading this, it means we were wrong. He chose someone. Maybe that's the only way this ends." Tavian closed the journal slowly, hands trembling. The black device in the safe began to blink, a soft, pulsing red light that hadn't been active a moment ago. Tavian stepped back, unsure if he should even touch it. But the dog nudged it gently with his nose, then looked at Tavian, as if to say, "It's time." Against every instinct, Tavian picked it up. The blinking turned solid. Then the screen lit up. "Hello, Emmerich Veilhart. We've been waiting." Tavian stared at the screen, his breath caught in his throat. The message glowed in pale blue letters. "Hello, Emmerich Veilhart. We've been waiting." He blinked twice, as if the name might disappear. Emmerich Veilhart, he'd seen it in Greythorne's journal. It wasn't his name, but something about it clung to him like smoke. The device pulsed once more and then went still, its screen fading back into black. No buttons, no interface, just that chilling greeting and the silence that followed. He looked at the dog. Subject 9? The shepherd sat motionless, staring not at Tavian, but at the far wall of the room, as if waiting for something else to happen. Tavian's mind raced. The journal, the names, the safe. Whoever Emmerich Veilhart was, someone or something believed Tavian had taken his place. Was it just mistaken identity? Or had the dog chosen him because he fit some invisible pattern? Either way, someone had gone to great lengths to ensure this device only activated under the right conditions. And it had responded to him. Downstairs, the wind rattled the front door. Tavian jolted, the noise breaking the thick quiet of the house. He tucked the device and journal into his bag and stood, suddenly very aware of how exposed he was in a house that had been abandoned for over 2 decades. As he stepped into the hallway, the floorboards groaned beneath him. The shepherd followed closely, his presence steadying. They descended the stairs together, both alert now, both changed by whatever they had just discovered. As Tavian reached the living room, he noticed something he hadn't before. The window beside the front door clean. Not dusty like the others. Someone had looked out recently. Or worse, someone had looked in. He moved quickly, securing the front lock and drawing the curtains. Whoever was watching, if anyone still was, would find it harder now. But the weight in his gut told him they weren't far. He didn't believe in paranoia. He believed in instinct. And every instinct he had was screaming, "They know you found it." Back in his truck, Tavian turned the engine over and glanced once more at the house. It no longer looked abandoned. It looked like it had simply been waiting, just like the dog, just like the message. He didn't know what Emberfield really was, or who Emmerich Veilhart had been. But someone had orchestrated this moment. Not by chance, by design. As the truck rumbled down the dirt road, Tavian tightened his grip on the wheel. Behind him, the shepherd sat quietly, watching the trees blur past. Somewhere out there, someone was expecting Emmerich Veilhart to return. And Tavian was beginning to wonder if he really wasn't. The road twisted through a patch of woods denser than Tavian remembered. He hadn't said a word since leaving Greythorne's house. The dog, silent as ever, lay in the passenger seat with his head resting on his paws, but his eyes remained open, scanning the world beyond the window. Tavian's fingers tightened around the steering wheel each time the trees seemed to close in tighter. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't stay still. Not after that message. Not after that name. Whoever they were, they thought he was Emmerich Veilhart. And maybe, for now, that was safer than the truth. About 10 miles outside of Fairhollow, Tavian pulled off the road and parked near an old, boarded-up gas station he remembered from decades ago. He needed time to think, to breathe. The device in his bag hadn't lit up again, but he couldn't stop replaying its words. "We've been waiting." That meant someone or something was still out there, watching, maybe even following. He didn't see any cars behind him, but that didn't calm his nerves. Tavian had the uneasy sense that this wasn't about being chased in the ordinary way. It was bigger, older. He reached into the bag and pulled out the journal again. There, scribbled in the back pages, was a name he'd skimmed earlier but hadn't thought much about. Keaton Marshbourne. No notes, just a reference. The last clean hand. Trust cautiously. Tavian wasn't sure what that meant, but he needed a lead. Anything. He reached for his phone and searched the name. Surprisingly, there was a match. A retired military officer who now ran a private security firm 2 counties over. Tavian wrote down the address. It was better than sitting in the dark, waiting to be found. The dog suddenly perked up. Tavian froze. The shepherd's ears were upright, his gaze locked on something behind the station. Tavian followed his eyes and saw nothing. No sound, no wind, just trees. But the dog was alert, tense, his body low to the ground now, like he was preparing to defend. Tavian stuffed the journal and the device back into his bag, started the engine, and didn't look back as he pulled onto the road again. As the gas station disappeared in the rearview mirror, Tavian gripped the wheel and muttered under his breath. What the hell did you bring me into? He wasn't talking to himself. He was talking to the dog. And for a moment he thought he saw it, the faintest nod, as if the animal understood the weight of what was coming. Something had been awakened. The sky was beginning to darken again by the time Tavian reached the edge of Mapleford, a town barely large enough to appear on most maps. His knuckles were tight on the steering wheel, the highway humming beneath his tires like a heartbeat he didn't trust. The shepherd hadn't moved from the passenger seat, but his eyes were no longer scanning. He was focused now, head upright, staring at the road ahead, as if he recognized where they were going. Tavian hadn't told the dog anything. He barely knew what he was doing himself. But the further they drove, the more convinced he became that the animal wasn't just following him. He was guiding him. Keaton Marshbourne's private security firm sat in a converted train depot at the edge of town. It looked abandoned from the outside. Windows covered in newspaper, faded signs, a cracked parking lot overtaken by weeds. Tavian hesitated as he turned off the ignition. What was he walking into? Marshbourne had been mentioned in the journal, but vaguely. The last clean hand. That didn't mean trustworthy. It just meant he hadn't been compromised yet, or hadn't been caught. Inside, the depot was quiet, too quiet. Tavian stepped cautiously, the dog at his side. The reception area was empty, but a single fluorescent light buzzed overhead. He knocked on the counter. Keaton Marshbourne? His voice echoed slightly. Nothing. Then a low creak. A man emerged from a side hallway, tall, broad-shouldered, and walking with the weariness of someone who'd been waiting for trouble. He wore a dark green sweater, sleeves pushed up to reveal forearms scarred by time, not war. His eyes narrowed at Tavian, then drifted down to the shepherd. You brought the dog, Marshbourne said, not as a question but a statement. He stepped forward slowly, eyeing the animal with a strange mixture of recognition and dread. You're not Emmerich Veilhart. No, Tavian replied carefully. But apparently I'm next. Marshbourne studied him in silence. Then he nodded once and motioned toward a heavy metal door behind the counter. Come with me. We don't have long. Tavian followed, unsure whether to feel relief or fear. Inside, the room was lined with old surveillance monitors, maps, and dusty boxes labeled with codes Tavian couldn't understand. Marshbourne pulled out a binder, opened it to the middle, and showed Tavian a faded photo. 8 men in uniform, one of them clearly younger Greythorne. Another, the spitting image of the man Tavian saw in the mirror every morning. This was Unit Ashmere, Marshbourne said, voice low. And that, he pointed to the dog, was never supposed to survive them. Tavian stared at the photo in stunned silence. The resemblance wasn't just close, it was undeniable. One of the soldiers in the picture looked exactly like him, down to the scar on his chin. But the photo was dated over 40 years ago. That man couldn't be him. And yet, somehow, it was. His hands trembled slightly as he turned the page, revealing another photo. This time of the same German shepherd, surrounded by the same 8 men from the previous image. But this time, Every man wore a look of unease. Not one was smiling. "What the hell was Ashmere?" Tavian asked. Keaton Marshbourne leaned against the wall, arms crossed, the weight of old decisions pulling down his face. Ashmere was a memory manipulation unit, not combat experimentation. They used psychological conditioning, synthetic memories, even biological implants to see how much a mind could be changed or rebuilt. He tapped the photo. The dog was part of it. Subject 9. Designed to bond with only one person at a time. Once bonded, it couldn't be reassigned. It remembered everything, even when we didn't. Tavian felt the world tilt slightly. So what? Am I one of them? A clone? A ghost? He laughed bitterly, but it didn't reach his eyes. The dog sat quietly by his feet, as if understanding every word, yet choosing not to intervene. Marshbourne didn't laugh. "No, you're Tavian Crosswell. Born in 1968, raised in the Carolinas, served as a mechanic, lost your wife in a fire." He paused. "But you were chosen, because your DNA matches a man from that unit, Emmerich Veilhart. Someone they erased. Someone who knew too much. The program left remnants in his bloodline. They needed a new host to unlock what was left." Tavian sat down, the weight of it all folding him in half. "So I've just been walking into a past that isn't mine?" "No," Marshbourne said quietly. "You've been walking into a truth they tried to bury. That dog didn't find you by accident. He was trained to identify the person with the strongest genetic link to Emmerich." He looked down at the shepherd. "And he chose you." Suddenly the power flickered. A high-pitched tone emitted from one of the monitors, then cut to black. Marshbourne's face went pale. "They found us." Tavian reached for his bag, pulling the device from within. The screen lit up again, pulsing steadily. A new message appeared. "Corbin Ashmere online. Termination protocols engaged." And in that instant, Tavian understood. Ashmere wasn't just a name. It was still alive, and it was coming for them. The room was plunged into a sickly red glow as emergency lights activated across Marshbourne's facility. Sirens blared in the distance. Not loud, but deliberate, controlled. Tavian stood frozen, the device still glowing in his hand, its final message staring back at him. "Corbin Ashmere online. Termination protocols engaged." The shepherd was already on his feet, ears upright, body positioned between Tavian and the nearest door. Marshbourne didn't waste a second. He pulled open a false panel in the wall and motioned for Tavian to follow. "This way. There's a back exit that leads into the woods," Marshbourne said. "They won't risk sending a team in if we scatter. They want a clean retrieval, not a shootout." As they moved down the narrow hall, Tavian's thoughts spun in all directions. Corbin Ashmere wasn't just a ghost from the journal. He was alive, or at least his program was. Something artificial, digital. And now it was awake, chasing the last remnants of what it failed to erase. The journal, the dog, him. Everything he thought was coincidence was part of a controlled chain of events set in motion long before he'd ever stepped into that shelter. They burst out into the cold night, the forest swallowing them whole. For several minutes, they ran in silence, the dog staying close, moving with purpose. Finally, Marshbourne stopped near a clearing. "This is where I leave you," he said. "They won't stop unless the source code is destroyed, and I'm on their radar. But you still have a window." Tavian pulled the device from his bag. "And what am I supposed to do with this?" "Go to where it began. 141 Wren Hollow Lane. The basement." Marshbourne paused. "It's not just a house. It was the entry point to the mainframe. There's a kill switch. Greythorne built it, but he never got the chance to use it." Tavian looked down at the shepherd, who stood ready, tail still, eyes glowing in the moonlight. The silence between them was no longer strange. It was steady, trusting. Tavian nodded. Hours later, just before dawn, Tavian stepped back into Greythorne's house. Felt different now, charged. The dog led him to a hidden door beneath the stairs, long sealed with rusted bolts. Inside, the basement pulsed with low, humming energy. Servers lined the walls, dust-coated and blinking softly. At the center, a console with a single red switch. Tavian didn't hesitate. He placed the device into the port, and the screen flared one last time. "Are you ready to forget?" He looked down at the shepherd. The dog didn't blink. "Yes," Tavian said, and with one final press, everything went dark.